Welcome to this explainer. Have you ever caught yourself wondering, does prison actually work? Well, today we're embarking on a pretty fascinating journey through the key concepts of the final stages of the justice system. We're going from the moment of a crime all the way through to the consequence. We're going to trace the very origins of punishment, unpack the realities of modern corrections, and look at exactly what the evidence says about the future of criminology. If you want to truly understand how our society responds to crime and what actually works to prevent it, you are absolutely in the right place.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our structured roadmap for today. We'll start with the history of the prison, move right into jails versus prisons, examine the goals of incarceration, look at supervision in the community, discuss re-entry and collateral consequences, and finally, we'll wrap up by exploring evidence and the future.
Section 1. History of the prison. From public punishment to the modern institution.
Now, it's really important to realize that the prison, as we understand it today, is actually a relatively modern invention. For most of history, confinement wasn't the punishment at all. It was basically just a holding pen. Up until the 18th century, punishment was largely corporal, or it involved public humiliation. But then, Enlightenment reformers pushed for a genuinely new idea. They thought, what if we confined offenders for a set period of time to actually change them? This ultimately led to the 19th century American models. You had the Pennsylvania system, which was all about solitary confinement, and the Auburn system, which focused on silent congregate labor. And honestly, both of those systems, as we know now, caused serious psychological harm. By the mid-20th century, we shifted again, this time to a medical model. This meant treating crime almost like a condition to be cured through rehabilitation. But fast forward to the 1970s, and rising crime combined with intense political pressure sparked what we call a punitive turn. This era brought determinate sentencing, mandatory minimums, and a massive, unprecedented expansion of the incarcerated population. Understanding this history is absolutely crucial, because our current policy debates, they're largely just arguments between these historical models.
Section 2. Jails versus prisons. Understanding correctional facilities.
And this brilliantly illustrates a common point of confusion. People use the words jail and prison interchangeably all the time, but they're fundamentally different institutions. Jails are locally operated, usually by county sheriffs. They experience massive daily turnover and essentially have to intake anyone brought to the front door. But most importantly, they hold people serving sentences under a year alongside a really large population of legally innocent people who are just awaiting trial. Prisons, on the other hand, are state or federally operated. They hold individuals who have already been convicted of felonies and are serving sentences generally longer than a year. Because of this, prisons have a much more stable population, and they're categorized by strict security levels, ranging all the way from minimum security up to supermax.
A genuinely crucial piece of the jail system is pretrial detention. This just means holding individuals in jail before their actual trial. Often, these legally innocent individuals are held simply because they literally cannot afford to pay bail. This dynamic has made bail reform a highly significant policy debate today. Because, as the data shows, even short pretrial stays can cause people to lose their jobs, their housing, and even child custody, while simultaneously massively increasing the pressure on them to just accept a guilty plea so they can finally go home.
Both jails and prisons face a host of persistent, really tough operational challenges. We're talking about severe overcrowding, aging physical facilities, and intense staffing shortages that lead to deep burnout among workers. But perhaps most surprisingly, because of the incredibly high rates of mental illness and substance use disorders among inmates, jails and prisons have effectively become the primary mental health providers in many of our communities. This is a role they were absolutely never designed for and, frankly, are poorly equipped to handle.
Section 3. The goals of incarceration. What does it accomplish?
So, let's turn our focus to the actual purpose of sentencing. We ask a lot of our prison system, but we have to step back and ask this critical question as objectively as possible. What does incarceration actually accomplish? When we break down the data goal by goal, does it actually deliver on its promises?
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it shows prison as a powerful but very blunt instrument. If the goal is retribution, delivering proportionate punishment, it plainly delivers. But keep in mind, that's a moral claim. If the goal is incapacitation, simply keeping the public safe by removing someone, it works. But it yields diminishing returns as offenders age out of their high-risk years. What about deterrence? Well, research shows that adding years to a sentence actually has very little added deterrent effect. Why? Because offenders tend to discount distant consequences. Certainty of capture matters much, much more than the severity of the sentence. And rehabilitation, It absolutely can work when you use proper programming like cognitive behavioral therapy, but the harsh, isolated prison environment itself often works directly against those positive changes.
The ultimate reality of relying solely on confinement is high recidivism. The data clearly indicates that a huge fraction of released people are rearrested within just a few years. It turns out, incarceration alone rarely resolves the underlying drivers of why someone offends in the first place, and it carries massive direct fiscal costs to taxpayers as well as invisible, indirect costs to families and communities.
Section 4. Supervision in the community. Probation, parole, and intermediate sanctions. Here is a fact that might surprise you. The vast majority of correctional work doesn't actually happen behind physical walls. It happens out in the community. Let's take a second to clearly contrast two terms that are constantly misunderstood. Probation is a sentence served in the community instead of incarceration. It is imposed directly by a court. Parole, however, is a conditional release into the community after an offender has already served a portion of a prison sentence. So the easiest way to remember this: probation is instead of prison, parole is after prison.
The community corrections landscape is incredibly vast. It includes intermediate sanctions, things like electronic monitoring and halfway houses, as well as problem-solving courts that focus heavily on specific issues like drugs or mental health. These options provide a graduated response matched to risk, and they save an incredible amount of money compared to prison. But there are huge challenges. Officers often face massive, unmanageable caseloads, making meaningful supervision nearly impossible. Furthermore, technical violations, this means things like simply missing an appointment or failing a drug test, not actually committing a new crime, send substantial numbers of people straight back to prison. It is a major and often completely invisible driver of our incarcerated population.
Section 5. Re-entry and collateral consequences. Returning to the community.
This brings our attention to the most crucial, yet frequently overlooked, phase of the entire justice journey. So the crucial point is this: nearly everyone who goes to prison eventually comes home. Hundreds of thousands of incarcerated people are released back into society every single year. The question is never whether people will return to our communities, but whether they will return prepared or totally abandoned. Imagine the exact moment someone is released. They face immediate, formidable barriers. We're talking about a sudden lack of housing, with many landlords actively excluding people who have records. They face severe employment screening. They suffer dangerous lapses in healthcare and addiction treatment. Many can't even secure basic identification like a driver's license. The absolute riskiest period for reoffending or overdose is those first few days and weeks right after release, which is precisely when community support is usually at its thinnest.
And those practical barriers, they are compounded by collateral consequences. These are the persistent legal and regulatory disabilities that stay attached to a conviction long after the formal sentence ends. We're talking about things like blocked public benefits, lost voting rights, or occupational licensing bans that stop people from working in certain fields. These invisible punishments perfectly illustrate what criminologists call labeling theory. The formal label of a conviction restricts access to conventional opportunities. It actively blocks the stable work and relationships that research proves are exactly what's needed to prevent someone from reoffending.
Section 6. Evidence and the future. What works in criminology?
Let's move to and see how this builds into data-driven solutions. We're pivoting from the problems of the system to what actually works. Let's look at the most influential framework in the field today, the Risk-Need Responsivity, or R&R model. Evidence shows that to actually reduce recidivism, we must follow these 3 steps. Step 1 is risk. We must reserve intensive interventions for higher-risk individuals. Giving intensive programming to low-risk people actually makes outcomes worse by disrupting their lives and mixing them with high-risk peers. Step 2 is need. We must target criminogenic needs. These are the changeable factors actually linked to offending, like antisocial thinking or substance use. Step 3 is responsivity. Interventions must be matched to the person's learning style, motivation, and culture. When programs follow all 3 of these principles, they show meaningfully better outcomes.
Another proven alternative framework out there is restorative justice. Instead of just asking what punishment the offender deserves, it asks how to repair the harm that was done. By using victim-offender mediation, it brings affected parties together to identify obligations and concrete steps toward repair. Research consistently shows it yields high rates of victim satisfaction and modest but very real reductions in reoffending, especially when applied to lower-level cases. As we look forward, crime itself is rapidly evolving, and frankly, our methods have to evolve with it. The future of criminology means dealing with cybercrime and artificial intelligence, which are creating entirely new offenses and detection tools. It means tackling the globalization of transnational smuggling networks. It involves using predictive analytics, which, by the way, requires us to vigilantly guard against algorithmic bias that might simply reproduce past disparities. And perhaps most promisingly of all, it involves a public health approach to violence prevention, treating violence as a preventable health problem through proactive community intervention rather than just sitting back and waiting for police enforcement.
Crime is patterned. It's not random. Evidence beats intuition every time. Certainty of consequence matters much more than severity. As you carry these key concepts forward as informed citizens, whether that's into a new career or simply into the voting booth, these are the provocative questions you must always ask. What does a policy assume about why people offend? Who is being counted and who is missing from the data? And most importantly, what is the evidence? And compared to what? Keep asking those questions. Thank you for joining me on this explainer.